So we had two readings this week. The first being in Content Area Reading and Literacy. I will admit that I have the 6th edition and not the 7th. I don't think that there are enough major changes in those two to make a huge difference when we talk about them. And I didn't want to buy a new book, so I didn't. The other benefit about this being that this was my mentor's book before she retired, and so it has amazing notes in there, and I'm not quite willing to let go of it just yet. So I want to pull two things from this book that I thought were really important when I was rereading it. The first being on page 8 when they're talking about independent readers. So I really connected with this idea of independence being a relative state. So I think that this is both true situationally and then across time. So I see, especially within disciplinary literacy, what we're focusing in content area literacy while we're in this course, the idea that I might be a very competent and possibly even masterful reader in one domain and not another. I have a background in law as well, which means that when I sit in front of a legal document, I feel confident reading through it. However, I do not have a background in medicine or art. And when I go into situations where I need to read in those domains, that can be more intimidating, and I certainly have a much lower mastery at that type of reading. I also think that independence is relative in regards to time, because, for example, with technology, I think this can be very true. Someone can be very technologically literate, and then 20 years pass, and if you don't keep up with the way that the expectations of that literate practice have changed, you might no longer be at an independent level to be able to engage in that literacy within any community that's trying to use it. So the other big part of that being that independence can be achieved in groups, which I really love, because we focus so much in today's classrooms on individual performance, and yet in society things move forward in groups. We do very little alone. We work together. And so the idea that you can be independent as a group at accomplishing a task, even if the individual members are not independent, I think is extremely powerful, especially as there are a few practical problems in the real world that have independent solutions. And so I really love the idea of building independence and the ability to be an independent piece of a greater whole, which I think is really powerful. The second part of the reading that I wanted to draw a little bit more attention to was on page 11, and what it means to be literate. Now, I think that this is something that throughout your careers you've already had to and will continue to have to talk about, define, and redefine. That idea of what it means to be literate. This is such a moving target. 100 years ago you were literate if you could sign your name. 50 years ago you were literate if you could read and respond to basic materials. Today you have to be literate on so many levels, and so literacy needs a new definition. And I did go ahead and write one down just to make sure that I was thinking it through carefully. So to me, just so you know my biases, a person is literate in something if they can successfully create valid interpretations of the text's meaning and or create texts that align with the expectation of that literacy community. I struggled with this part. I struggled with the create, because I'm not sure that I believe you have to be able to create a text to be literate in that text. For example, I feel very literate in using applications on my computer. I'm literate in a computer literacy on a fairly deep level, but I couldn't create a computer program fluently. That's just not something I'd be capable of. So I go back and forth. My definition of what it means to be literate is still changing. And hopefully your guys' is too, because I feel like the more we're open to changing understandings, the more opportunity that we have to learn. So the last thing, and I will admit that I love this piece, it's one of my favorite things about bringing to this class, and that is the report to the National Committee on Reading, Chapter 5, which hopefully you guys read through and felt fairly comfortable with. I don't think that this reveals anything earth-shattering. Basically, my interpretation of the text is that when you're in different classes, you need to have different skills to succeed in those classes. When you're in a science classroom, you need to do things differently than you do when you're in a history classroom to be successful, because the people who work in those professions do things differently. And I absolutely love this. This is the backbone of content area reading and the backbone of disciplinary literacy. What I love most about this text, and if you click into the image that's in the Prezi, you'll be able to see it better, but that is the cover of that report. And just before you click into it, if you haven't already, take a second to think of what you think about that concept. How new does that concept feel to you? Because disciplinary literacy has a tendency to be seen as something that just recently started. Content area literacy tends to be, as you read in your text, tends to be traced back to the 70s, disciplinary literacy to the 90s, early 2000s. But this text was written in 1925. So these are not new concepts. They're just new names. We're not trying to rewrite what it means to be a teacher and what it means to teach reading and writing. We're just trying, again, to express it in a way that will help make meaningful changes in practice. And as you can tell, this was published in 1925, and yet there's really not been a lot done in between 1925 and 1970 on how we're teaching children to read and write in these different areas. So that's one of the goals of disciplinary literacy, and it's why I love this reading.